There comes a moment in every man's life when everything he built starts to fall apart. Relationships break, doors close, plans fail, and silence from God feels louder than ever. And in that moment, he asks himself the hardest question. Why is this happening to me when I'm trying to do everything right? But what if this breaking is not punishment? What if it is preparation? Because sometimes God doesn't destroy a man. He dismantles him, piece by piece, not to end his story, but to rebuild him into someone stronger, purer, and ready for a purpose he once could not carry. And this is where the real question begins. The question that quietly lives in the heart of every man who is going through pressure, confusion, and delay. He starts questioning everything. He wakes up with uncertainty and sleeps with thoughts he cannot explain. He looks at his life and wonders, if I am trying to be better, why is everything getting worse? If I am leaving my old ways, why am I losing people, opportunities, and stability at the same time? And slowly, without even realizing it, another deeper question rises inside him. Did I do something wrong? Or am I simply being abandoned? This is the moment where faith begins to shake, not because a man stops believing in God, but because he starts misunderstanding the process of God. Because from the outside, it truly looks like punishment. It looks like delay. It looks like rejection. It looks like silence. And silence is the hardest part. Because when there is no answer, the mind starts creating its own conclusions. The man begins to feel forgotten, overlooked, and unseen. He starts comparing his life with others and wonders why others seem to be moving forward, while he feels stuck in the same place, fighting invisible battles no one can see. But what he does not realize in that moment is that confusion is often the beginning of transformation. Because when God is changing a man deeply, he does not always announce it. He does not always explain it. Instead, he allows the man to sit in questions that have no immediate answers, because those questions slowly begin to break the wrong understanding of life, purpose, and strength. The man thinks he is being pushed away, but in reality, he is being pulled inward. He thinks he is losing direction, but in truth, he is being redirected. And this is why this question becomes so important, because it is not just a question of pain, it is a question of identity. Who am I becoming in this season? What is being removed from me that I can no longer carry into my future? And what is God trying to build inside me that I cannot see yet? These are not easy questions, and they are not meant to be answered quickly. They are meant to reshape a man slowly, silently, and deeply. Because before God can rebuild a man, he first makes him question everything he thought he understood about himself, his strength, and even his timing. And in that space of questioning, something powerful begins to happen. The breaking has already started, even if the man cannot see it yet. And this is where the process quietly shifts. Because once a man enters this season of questioning, something unusual begins to happen around him. People start to drift away without clear reasons, conversations become less frequent, and places that once felt familiar suddenly feel distant. At first, he thinks it is just coincidence, just timing, just life changing naturally. But slowly, he realizes that something deeper is happening. The same hands he used to rely on are no longer available. The same voices he used to depend on are no longer speaking into his situation, and the same environments that once gave him comfort no longer feel like home. And in that silence, a painful realization begins to form. He feels alone. But what he does not understand yet is that this isolation is not abandonment, it is alignment. Because before God elevates a man into a new level of responsibility, influence, or purpose, he often removes him from the noise that can contaminate his focus, not because those people are always bad, but because their presence is no longer aligned with the season he is entering. Elevation is not just about going higher, it is about becoming lighter. And sometimes what is heavy in a man's life is not physical weight, but emotional dependence, old attachments and distractions that keep pulling him backward while his future is trying to pull him forward. In this isolation, the man starts noticing something else too. The comfort he once had is gone. The easy access to distractions, validation, and emotional escape is no longer available in the same way. And at first, this feels like punishment, like rejection from life itself. But slowly, if he stays in that space long enough, something begins to change inside him. Because isolation has a strange power. It removes noise so truth can finally speak. When no one is constantly around to influence his thoughts, he is left alone with himself, his decisions, his fears, and his calling. And in that place, God begins to do something very personal. He begins to strip away the identity that was built on people's opinions, validation, and temporary connections. The man starts to realize that he was depending too much on external voices to define his direction. And now, in their absence, he is forced to hear something deeper within him. This is where real preparation begins, because a man who cannot stand alone will always struggle to stand in purpose. Isolation is not meant to break him, it is meant to stabilize him. It teaches him how to think without influence, how to grow without applause, and how to move without constant approval. And even though it feels like he has been removed from everything, in reality he is being separated for something greater. God is not pushing him away from people to punish him. He is pulling him away to prepare him, because before elevation becomes visible, isolation becomes necessary. And as this isolation deepens, something even more difficult begins to unfold within the man. The breaking itself. This is the stage where everything he once relied on starts to feel unstable. The confidence he used to carry begins to shake, the plans he was once certain about start collapsing, and the things he thought were permanent slowly begin to fade. And in this moment, it feels like everything is falling apart at once. But what he does not realize is that this breaking has a purpose far beyond what he can currently understand. Because God does not break a man without intention, and he does not allow pressure without purpose. The breaking is never random. It is always designed. It is the process of removing everything that cannot support the weight of his future. Because if a man enters his purpose with too much ego, it will destroy him. If he enters it with too much pride, it will blind him. If he enters it with too many attachments, it will hold him back. So the breaking becomes a divine process of emptying. God begins to remove what the man thought he needed, so he can discover what he actually needs. He starts stripping away false strength, the kind that looks strong on the outside but collapses under pressure. He removes dependence on validation, so the man can learn how to stand without needing constant approval. He removes comfort, so the man can build discipline. And in this emptying, something uncomfortable but necessary happens. The man begins to feel weak. But that weakness is not failure, it is exposure. It is the moment where he finally sees himself without all the layers he used to hide behind. And in that exposed state, something powerful begins to form. Because when a man is no longer filled with pride, distractions, or false confidence, he becomes available to be shaped. This is where true transformation begins, not in strength, but in surrender, not in control, but in letting go. The breaking teaches him that everything he was holding tightly was actually holding him back. And slowly, he starts to understand that God is not taking things away to hurt him, but to prepare him for something that requires a cleaner, stronger, and more grounded version of himself. This is why the purpose of breaking is so important. Because without it, a man would enter his destiny carrying the weight of his past, the noise of his ego, and the weakness of his dependencies. But through breaking, all of that is refined. He is not being destroyed, he is being purified. And even though it feels painful in the moment, it is actually protection in disguise. Because what God is building in him cannot stand on an unbroken foundation. It requires a man who has been emptied, refined, and rebuilt from within. And this is exactly the point where life begins to feel like it is completely falling apart. After the breaking, after the isolation, after the internal shaking, the external world starts to reflect what is happening inside. Things that once felt stable now begin to collapse one after another. Plans that were carefully built suddenly stop working. Opportunities that once seemed certain slip away without explanation. Relationships that once felt strong begin to fade or change unexpectedly. And in that moment, it truly feels like everything is going wrong at the same time, as if life itself has turned against him. This is the stage where most men feel like giving up, because nothing makes sense anymore, and nothing seems to respond to effort the way it used to. But what he cannot see in this chaos is that this is not random destruction. It is controlled removal, because sometimes, before God rebuilds a man's life, he first allows everything unstable to surface and fall apart. Anything that is built on convenience, emotion, or temporary alignment cannot survive this stage, so it begins to break away naturally. What looked like loss is actually exposure. What felt like rejection is actually separation, and what feels like delay is actually divine protection from walking into something that was never meant to last. In this season, silence becomes heavier. Prayers feel unanswered, efforts feel unnoticed, and direction feels unclear. The man starts questioning everything again, but this time on a deeper level. Not just about purpose, but about his entire existence. Why is nothing working? Why does everything I touch seem to fall apart? And yet, even in those questions, something deeper is happening within him. Because when everything external starts collapsing, internal dependence begins to grow. He is slowly being pushed away from relying on outcomes, people, and systems, and being pulled towards something greater that he cannot yet fully understand. And this is where the true shift begins, even though it does not feel like it. Because when everything starts falling apart, it forces the man to stop building his identity on external stability. He begins to realize that if his peace depends on circumstances, then he will never truly be at peace. If his confidence depends on success, then he will always be unstable. So in this breaking of everything around him, God is actually rebuilding something within him that cannot be shaken by external loss. And even though it feels like everything is ending, in reality, it is just everything false coming to an end. The foundations that cannot support his future are being removed. The illusions that once gave comfort are being exposed. And slowly, beneath all the chaos, something real is beginning to form. Because God never allows everything to fall apart without intention. He only allows it when something stronger is about to take its place. And when everything around him finally settles into silence, something unexpected begins to happen. At first, the silence feels unbearable. There are no clear answers, no immediate changes, no visible progress, and no comforting voices to fill the emptiness. It is in this silence that the man feels the weight of everything most deeply. Because when life is loud, pain can be distracted. But when everything goes quiet, truth becomes unavoidable. And this is where transformation slowly begins, not in a dramatic moment, but in the stillness that most people try to escape. In this silence, the man is no longer surrounded by noise that once influenced his thoughts. There are no distractions to hide behind, no constant validation to rely on, and no external direction to follow blindly. He is left alone with his thoughts, his fears, his memories, and his questions. And at first, this feels like punishment, like being abandoned in a place where nothing is moving forward. But over time, something subtle begins to shift within him. He starts to notice that the silence is not empty. It is full of reflection, full of lessons, full of truth that was always there, but never heard before. This is where God begins to work in a way that cannot be seen from the outside. Because transformation is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it happens in the quiet rebuilding of a man's mindset, where old thinking patterns are slowly being replaced by deeper understanding. He begins to question not just what is happening to him, but who he is becoming through it. And in that questioning, something powerful starts to form. Awareness. Awareness of his weaknesses. Awareness of his dependencies. And awareness of the things he once ignored while chasing comfort and validation. And in this silence, something even deeper happens. The man starts to reconnect with himself, not the version of himself that was shaped by people's expectations or temporary success, but the version that exists beneath all of that. He begins to realize that he was never just the roles he played, the failures he faced, or the labels others placed on him. There is something more foundational within him that is now slowly being revealed. And even though it feels uncomfortable, this revelation is necessary for transformation. Because true transformation does not happen in noise, it happens in stillness. It happens when a man is no longer running, no longer escaping, and no longer distracting himself from what needs to be understood. In that silence, character is reshaped, priorities are realigned, and strength is redefined. He starts learning how to sit with discomfort without running away, how to think without confusion, and how to exist without external validation. And slowly, without even realizing it, the silence that once felt like emptiness begins to feel like preparation. Because what God is building in him during this quiet season is not temporary confidence, but permanent transformation. A change that is not dependent on circumstances, but rooted in understanding. And this is the hidden beauty of silence. It does not just remove noise, it rebuilds identity. And as this silence continues to shape him, something even deeper begins to be revealed. Pressure starts to rise again, but this time it is different. It is not the same confusion he felt before, and it is not the same breaking he experienced earlier. This pressure feels more targeted, more precise, as if life itself is pressing on every hidden part of him that was never fully exposed before. And in this stage, something undeniable begins to happen. Pressure begins to reveal truth, because when life is easy, a man can pretend. He can create an image of strength without actually being strong. He can speak with confidence without truly being grounded. He can appear stable while hiding internal instability. But pressure does not allow that illusion to continue. Pressure removes the mask. It strips away the layers of false identity and exposes what is real underneath. And this is where the man begins to see himself not as he presented himself to the world, but as he truly is when everything external is removed. In this pressure, weaknesses that were once hidden start to surface. Old fears that were buried begin to rise again. Unresolved emotions, doubts, and insecurities that were ignored before now become impossible to avoid. And although this feels uncomfortable, even painful at times, it is actually a necessary revelation. Because God does not allow pressure to destroy a man, He allows it to reveal him, to show him what still needs healing, what still needs strengthening, and what still needs to be surrendered. And in this process, something powerful begins to form. Clarity. The man starts to understand that not everything in his life is aligned with his purpose. He begins to see which relationships were draining him, which habits were holding him back, and which beliefs were limiting his growth. Pressure begins to separate illusion from reality, and slowly, truth becomes clearer than ever before. What once felt confusing starts to make sense, not because circumstances changed, but because perception is changing within him. And this is where growth becomes unavoidable. Because once truth is revealed under pressure, ignorance is no longer an option. The man can no longer live in denial about who he is or where he is heading. He is forced to confront himself honestly, without filters, without excuses, and without distraction. And although this confrontation is difficult, it is also freeing, because truth, even when painful, always leads to direction. And slowly, he begins to realize something important. Pressure was never meant to break him down completely. It was meant to refine him. It was meant to show him what is real, so that everything false can be removed. Because a man who has been tested under pressure does not come out the same. He comes out more aware, more grounded, and more aligned with what truly matters. And this is the hidden purpose of pressure. It does not just expose weakness, it reveals truth. And once truth is revealed, transformation can no longer be stopped. And after all this pressure, after all this silence, after all this exposure of truth, there comes a point where the man finally feels like he has nothing left to hold on to. It feels like the process has reached its limit, like everything has already been taken, tested, and torn apart. And in that moment, a dangerous thought tries to enter his mind, that maybe this is the end, that maybe he has gone too far, lost too much, or been broken beyond repair. But this is exactly where the deepest misunderstanding happens, because what feels like the end is actually the beginning of something completely new. The breaking is not the end, it is the transition. It is the space between who he was and who he is becoming. Because God never breaks a man to leave him unfinished. He breaks him to rebuild him in a form that can carry purpose without collapsing under pressure. And in this stage, even though everything feels empty, something unseen is being carefully reconstructed within him. The foundation is being changed, the structure is being corrected, and the parts of him that were once unstable are being replaced with something stronger, something deeper, something more aligned with his destiny. But from the man's perspective, it does not feel like building. It feels like loss. It feels like delay. It feels like confusion that never ends. Because rebuilding does not always look like progress at first. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Sometimes it looks like nothing is happening at all. But in reality, the most important work is happening beneath the surface, where it cannot be seen, measured, or rushed. This is where character is being strengthened, where patience is being developed, and where identity is being redefined. And in this realization, something begins to shift within him. He starts to understand that the breaking he experienced was never meant to destroy him, but to prepare him for something he could not carry in his previous state. Because if he had entered his next season with his old mindset, his old dependencies, and his old limitations, he would not have been able to sustain what was coming. So the breaking was actually protection in disguise. It was God's way of making sure that when elevation comes, it does not destroy him from within. And slowly, the man begins to see that he is still standing. Even after everything he lost, even after everything that changed, he is still here. And that realization becomes powerful. Because it proves that what was removed was not essential, and what remains is what truly matters. Strength that survives breaking is not ordinary strength. It is refined strength. It is tested strength. It is strength that has been reshaped through experience rather than assumption. And this is where hope begins to return, quietly but steadily. Not because everything is fixed, but because understanding has begun to form. The breaking is no longer seen as destruction, but as preparation. And in that shift of perspective, the man starts to realize that he was never being taken apart to be forgotten. He was being taken apart to be rebuilt correctly. And now, after everything he has walked through, after the questions, the isolation, the breaking, the silence, the pressure, and the collapse of what once felt permanent, the man finally reaches a place where something inside him begins to settle. Not because all the answers have arrived, not because all the pain has disappeared, but because something deeper than understanding begins to form. Realization. This is the moment where he stops seeing his journey as chaos and starts seeing it as construction. He begins to understand that nothing he went through was wasted, nothing was random, and nothing was truly out of control the way it once felt. And in this final realization, he sees his past differently. The moments that once confused him now begin to make sense. The doors that closed no longer feel like rejection, but protection from paths that were never aligned with his purpose. The people who left no longer feel like loss, but removal of what could not grow with him. The delays that frustrated him no longer feel like punishment, but preparation for timing he could not have understood earlier. Even the pain, the silent nights, the mental battles, and the emotional weight now start to reveal a hidden purpose. They were shaping him into someone he could not have become without them. And this is where his perspective completely shifts. He no longer sees himself as abandoned or forgotten. Instead, he begins to see himself as guided through a process that was always intentional, even when it felt unclear. Because the truth is, God was not absent in his breaking. God was present in every detail, even in the moments where silence felt the loudest. And now he understands that silence was never absence, it was instruction. It was not the end of communication, It was a different kind of communication that required trust instead of explanation. And as this realization deepens, something powerful begins to happen within him. Gratitude starts to replace confusion. Not gratitude for the pain itself, but gratitude for what the pain produced. A stronger mindset, a deeper awareness, a quieter confidence that no longer depends on external validation. He begins to understand that the man he was becoming could only be formed through the very process he once resisted. And in that understanding, the weight he has been carrying does not necessarily disappear, but it becomes meaningful instead of meaningless. And finally, he realizes something that changes everything. He was never being destroyed. He was being designed, carefully, intentionally. Step by step, through breaking and rebuilding, through silence and pressure, through loss and redirection. And what once felt like an ending was actually a formation process for a completely new beginning. A beginning where he is no longer defined by what he lost, but by what he has become through it. And in this final realization, the journey makes sense not because it became easy, but because he finally understands its purpose. And that understanding becomes his strength. And now, as he stands at the end of this process, the final message becomes clear in his heart. He is no longer the same man who once questioned the breaking, the silence, and the pressure. He has been reshaped, refined, and realigned with something greater than his understanding. And even if life is still not perfect, he carries a new strength within him, a strength born from surrender, not control. So if you are in that same season right now, remember this truth deeply. You are not being destroyed, you are being developed, and what God is building in you will make sense in time, even if it doesn't make sense right now.